Chapter 36, Part 1. Wire. They were strung out on the pathway. Finbar was leading the way, nearly 50 yards ahead of them. Donnie and James, with blind Adolf pulled and shoved between them, came after, with Caitlin, Francois, Halstead, Rupert, and Renoir not far behind. Durant was lost in the line, just passing the black barges in the canal, closing fast with his companions. Behind them, the machine gun's stuttering roar raged on in the tunnel, the sound dampened by distance and the falling snow, but violent and nerve-shattering all the same. Caitlin was not sure what drew her eye. They were not moving. When she looked up, there seemed like a vast murder of crows sitting atop a long wire fence, staring down into the valley that the canal cut in the earth. Oh, Christ! She froze. 100 yards above them, fanned out across the eastern ridge, watching them struggle along the mule path with thousands upon thousands of men. Stop! Durant's cry split the night air. He saw them too. Finbar looked back. Durant pointed up the steep incline. They all looked to the ridge. The line of dead men just stood there, watching them. It had the air of a taunt, like some feral cat toying with a bird whose neck it had already broken. Finbar nearly jumped in the canal and swam for it as he had in the Somme, but he knew his left hand would be useless. Durant snapped him out of it. Come on! Durant yelled. He leapt onto the foredeck of the black barge and waved them back toward him. Come on! Caitlin and Francois turned Halstead around, and they ran. Ahead of them, Durant led Rupert and Renoir onto the barge. Go! He yelled, and they pressed on to the opposite bank. When Caitlin, Francois, and Halstead got to the barge, Durant helped pull Halstead onto the deck. Then the four ran and slipped across the snowy barges, jumping the gap to the pathway on the other side. Donnie and James pulled Adolf around and were dragging him back down to the barges when Finbar bolted past and leapt up. He slipped in the snow and went down hard on the barge deck. Fuck! He yelled. He pushed himself to standing with his good hand and ran. As James, Adolf, and Donnie reached the barge, Wolfgang and Jonah came racing out of the tunnel. James and Donnie pulled Adolf between them, awkwardly hauling him across, nearly tumbling with him into the water. Before they reached the second barge, Wolfgang and Jonah made the jump onto the first and ran after them. When they caught the Americans, Donnie released Adolf's arm. He figured Germans ought to take care of Germans. Donnie looked back, gobsmacked, at the corpses on the ridge. It only took one glance to tell him this was a losing battle. At the epicenter of the legion of men, a figure on horseback appeared. Before her, another demon stepped forward, long lance in hand. The lance wielder took a dozen strides down the slope of the steep hill and stopped. The woman on horseback raised her sword overhead. Donnie swallowed hard. He knew what would happen when that sword dropped. He was done looking out for anybody but himself. He jumped across to the second barge, tearing across it past reason. He ran awkwardly on his bad leg, Mauser banging against his hip, but he moved faster than James could with blind Adolf in tow. He cleared the water and landed on the path, then threw himself into a mad scramble up the ravine. Donnie! James yelled after him, but Donnie did not slow. Jonah grabbed Adolf's other arm. Together, he and James pulled him across the barges with Wolfgang just behind them. A sideways glance into the tunnel shot a bolt of terror through James. The light of the open door at the machine gun nest went dark as a mass of men piled through it and ran onto the mule path. Oh, my Lord, they're coming! James yelled. Jonah did not need to look to know what was coming out of the tunnel after them. They pulled Adolf across the path and began the miserable ascent up the canyon wall, following Durant, Renoir, Rupert, Finbar, and Donny. James led the way, saying, "Oh Lord, oh Lord, oh Lord, oh Lord," as he climbed. The avalanche that Wolfgang had foreseen was there. All they could do now was run and die. Isaiah ran from the burning lock-keeper's house with Black Betty, down the front steps, full bore, into the snowy field, past the formless, snow-covered, burned-out husk of Field Sergeant Hans Rosenblatt. The escarpment declined before them as they raced toward the canal gorge, a straight shot on open ground. They covered the distance like lightning. When they approached the precipice, directly overlooking the tunnel mouth, and the black barges moored beyond it, Isaiah and the Mastiff slowed their headlong sprint. The gorge, the Napoleon's engineers blasted and cut from the earth 100 years prior, lay before them, giving a God's eye view of the battlefield. God damn. The nearest demons were to Isaiah's left, 50 yards below and 100 yards distant. They stretched out in their long line, an army of thousands arrayed atop the crest of the canyon. The scope of the force, their absolute stillness like a too long held breath, building to inevitable explosion, was terrifying. Isaiah eased his way to the sharp edge of the cliff. Beyond the lip was a straight drop, 200 yards down, into neck-breaking shallow water. The ledge he stood on towered just above the tunnel mouth. It was slightly angled, and even without the wet snow, it would have been life-threatening to approach. Black Betty's instincts taught her to keep her distance. She shied away as Isaiah fought through his own fear and stopped just at the precipice. To his right, the dark specks of his companions were visible, running along the canal bank, turning for the hillside, clambering up its steep face. They looked like ants running through spilled sugar. They seemed near as helpless. A massive fist was hanging over them, ready to come down and smash the pests to smithereens. Isaiah saw James, Jonah, Wolfgang, and Adolf clear the second barge and start up the gorge wall behind Rupert. Beyond them, nearly 3/4 of the way to the peak, was Finbar. Donny was not far behind him, scrabbling gamely up. Another 10 yards down the canal, Durant and Renoir were climbing. Below them on the pathway, he saw Francois and Caitlin pulling Halstead. Francois yanked Halstead sideways and began dragging him up the canyon side. "Climb!" Isaiah heard him roar to Caitlin. She stumbled but held on to Halstead's other arm, following Francois's lead. The three surged up the steep hillside, desperate. Movement to his left turned his eyes. Leonie rode to the centre of her battalions. Beside her, the man carrying the cavalry lance stepped forward. Leonie raised a sword overhead. Isaiah inhaled deeply. He raised the lantern glass, exposing the wick, and set it on the precipice. He took his matchbox out, pulled out a matchstick, and carefully struck it. He cupped it in his hand, let the wood take, then held it out to the wick. It caught. Isaiah spun the key, turning the wicking flame up as high as it would go. He took another deep inhale. He hoped to Christ that the petrol fumes he tasted in the air were not just remnants of kerosene on his hands. As the lantern's flame leapt and danced, he lowered the glass chimney. Isaiah glanced down at the file of dead on the canyon wall. The nearest to him were looking up now. The flame had caught their eyes. A group broke off from the brethren and began grinding up the slope toward him. "Ah, fuck," said Isaiah. The Red Maiden saw the movement at her army's right flank and the flicker of light on the ledge above the tunnel that drew them. She was glad of their willingness to seize the initiative. She turned her focus back to the quarry that was stumbling up the opposite bank of the canal. The time had come. She lowered her sword arm. Below her, Ganan leapt down the hill, spear raised overhead, screaming his war cry. The 6,000 men ranged out across the peak exploded after him, erupting over the edge and running pell-mell down the embankment, the screams joining his as they came. As the mass of men roared down the hill toward the canal, Black Betty began barking. She put herself between Isaiah and the 14 dead men slogging up the steep, snow-covered cliff toward them. The 6,000 corpses followed Ganan, avalanching toward the canal and Isaiah's companions. Isaiah leaned out over the cliff. He dropped the burning lantern. It floated down toward the water, past the falling snow, seeming to hang forever, cutting a bright trail in the evening gloom. It struck the canal with a quiet splash. It doused Black the moment it submerged. The flame suffocated the second that it hit. Fuck. Isaiah scrambled back from the edge. He turned from the dead men climbing toward him and round down the hill to his right, Black Betty just behind him. They raced toward the trench and the thick ribbon of barbed wire entanglements that signified the border of the Siegfried line. Ganan was 20 yards ahead of his comrades. He locked eyes on the man he intended to take as his prize. Halstead was being pulled up the steep slope across the water, Caitlin on one side of him, Francois on the other. As Ganan neared the canal bank, he feared he would lose his chance. On the run, he hauled his arm back and loosed the spear, letting all the momentum of his charge take the lance into flight. He nearly stumbled from the effort, but caught his footing and kept on, watching the weapon fly. It was beautiful. The lance cut the air, straight and true, lofting over the black water of the San Quentin Canal, arcing in a perfect line, striking and spearing through the small of Dr. Halstead's back. Halstead collapsed, screaming. His dead weight ripped him from Caitlin and Francois. Caitlin felt his hand tear free from her grasp. She cried out and turned back as he fell, but Francois grabbed hold of her. "Non, il est mort, allons-y!" Halstead went backward down the hill, sliding and tumbling in the snow, leaving a spatter of red in his wake. The lance shaft snapped in two, and he screamed again, blacking out, as the sharp blade stirred and severed his insides past repair. Caitlin saw Ganan leap down onto the path and splash into the water, fighting through it. Halstead lay in the snow, unmoving, blood saturating the whiteness around him. The first ranks of the 6,000 splashed into the water all along the length of the canal. Caitlin grabbed hold of Francois's outstretched hand, and he pulled her up the ravine with him. Durant, Renoir, and Finbar had all turned west and were scrabbling up the steep wall of the canyon when the screams of the coming mob of dead men reached them. Durant looked to his right, where Rupert and James led Jonah, Adolf, and Wolfgang up the hillside. He heard Halstead's cry and glanced back in time to see the body come to a rest on the canal bank. The lance head pointed angrily out of his belly, dark with blood. Durant dug in and fought his way upward. Halstead was gone, past saving. All that mattered now was running. There was no fighting left to be done. She was over 150 yards away, but Renoir saw the shape of her face. He knew who was coming. Leonie. He did not look back when Halstead cried out. He plunged ahead, up the hillside. Renoir could feel his own reckoning coming for him now. He decided he would run as far and as fast as he could before she struck home. The Red Maiden let Joshua take his time on the descent, following her charging army, dedicated to patience. As Halstead fell, she kept her eyes on the ginger girl and the big black man fighting their way up the canyon directly across from her. Tonight, that shotgun on her back would not save her. She might exhaust it on one or two of her pursuers, but she could not stop more than that. Then Gunhilda's men would kill the African and bring her the ginger girl to do with as she pleased. Rushing Joshua down into the gorge would serve no purpose. Patience was all. As Adolf stumbled up the wall of the gorge, dragged by Jonah and Wolfgang, he reached up and grabbed his blindfold. He lifted the gauze and peeked back. When the army of men crashed down the gorge through the snow, his eyes went wide. He ripped off the blindfold and threw it aside. He yanked himself free from Jonah and Wolfgang's hands. Adrenaline surged through him. He launched himself toward the peak. Halstead awoke. The white of the blistering sun burned his retinas. He used his hands to shield himself from its assault. He sat up and looked down at his belly. There was still the memory of pain flashing through him, but he was unwounded. His head ached. He wanted a fucking cigarette in the worst way. Halstead felt in his pocket and to his great joy found a full, fresh pack of Navy Player's Cut. He fished one out of the box and stuck it between his lips, then took the Lucifer matchbox out of his shirt front pocket. He struck the head on the heel of his boot and lit the cigarette, breathing it in, then exhaling the smoke through his nose, relishing the pain it caused. The rush of the nicotine striking his bloodstream, the drug speeding to his brain to bring it peace. Dona nobis pacem, he sang quietly to himself, echoing the plea he'd sung in church many times over as he sat next to his beautiful wife and contemplated his beautiful life on the Sundays before he blew it all to pieces. Yes, give me some bloody fucking peace. He gazed out at the surrounding desert. Several hundred yards away, the stark vista was broken by a roadhouse diner with a tall red gas pump outside it. He stood up and took another drag on the cigarette, tapping the ash, thoughtful. Then he headed across the sand toward the diner. He wondered where the hell he was. It might be desert, but it was not Australian bush, at least not any part where he had done walkabout. He knew then that he must be dreaming. By the time he reached the roadhouse, he had finished the cigarette. He flicked it away and sat down on the front steps, catching his breath. The scent of food from the diner wafted through the screen door, welcoming, inviting him in. The scent reminded him of Adele in their cozy kitchen, baking her banana and dulce de leche pavlova. It was her specialty and his personal favourite. His mouth watered at the memory. His heart broke a bit more as he recalled how deeply his betrayal had scarred her. He slid out another Player's Cut and brought it to his lips. He took out his lucifers. "Help you, mister!" croaked an old woman's voice from behind him. He glanced back at the old crone. She was approaching the screen, wiping her hands clean with a musty dish rag. "Why don't you come on in, honey?" "No, thank you. I'll just have a cigarette first, madam. But I appreciate the invitation." He slid the box open and took a match out. "Don't do that there, honey. You can come on in here and smoke to your heart's content." Halstead looked back at her. "Fine right here." "But you ain't," she said. The malice beneath it was brutal cold. Halstead stood up and dusted off his pants. He smiled, backed away from her. "No offense intended, madam," he said, measured. The old woman opened the screen door and stood back. A she-wolf on a rope leash stepped through ahead of her, followed by a feral, grinning little boy. Halstead stopped when he reached the gas pump. He felt its shadow on his back. and smelled its invisible fumes bubbling up. The she-wolf growled and strained at the rope, canines dripping saliva onto the dusty wooden stoop. "Journey's in, good Dr. Halstead," the old woman said from the confines of the roadhouse. "Time to give up the ghost and come inside, before you end up getting yourself hurt worse than you already be." Halstead knew she was right. He could feel the end coming. He knew what he ought to do. Instead, he brought the lucifer match to the match strike. He slid it along the gritty sand and powdered glass fused to the matchbox edge. The little boy dropped the rope. The she-wolf leapt from the top stair. The match sparked orange. Halstead's vision flashed to white as the wolf struck his midsection with her teeth. Pain scythed, jagged and hot through Halstead's core and vibrated out. His eyes shot open. He looked to the dark sky and the white snow tumbling down from the heavens. The stench from his punctured bowels mixed in with petrol fumes that was saturating the surrounding air. He felt something in the palm of his left hand. He realized he was holding his matchbox. A match was pinched between his right thumb and forefinger, trembling from the agony of the gut wound. Ganan rose out of the canal. He towered over Halstead. The body wore a German army uniform, but Halstead knew who was inside the meat puppet pulling its strings. "I'm sorry," he whispered to Ganan. "I'm so sorry." Tears ran out of his eyes. He struck the match. There was a whooshing sound all around as the fuel, flowing and floating invisibly above and down the canal, responded to the match strike. The air itself inhaled the tiny lick of ignition, then sent it roaring outward into the mixture of fuel and oxygen. The entire canal, the water itself, burst into flame, engulfing all in a raging storm of petroleum-fed hellfire. Halstead died in searing agony. The heat sucked the air from his lungs. The fire burned through his nerve endings. His tears, blood, and water boiled. His brain shut down as quickly as it could, sparing him the information that his senses were trying to pour into it, as his body broiled and charred away. Ganan saw the match head catch. Then the flames poured over him like molten liquid. His scream was pure rage, and it echoed out through the throng as the explosion in the canal put some 2,000 bodies to the torch in an instant. The 4,000 men coming behind them pulled up short on the far bank, biting back their desire to risk immolation so they could reach their prey who was scurrying toward the rim of the opposite canyon wall. A dozen of the dead had successfully breached the canal and barely missed being consumed in the explosion that got Ganan. They looked back across the flames, seeking guidance. The Red Maiden neared the mule path. Joshua tried to shy away from the fire, but she held his reins tight, wheeling him back around. She pointed her sword at the lip of the canyon where her quarry was disappearing. "Go!" she roared across the burning canal. The men in grey turned and began scratching and clawing up the incline, thirsting for hot blood, tasting it in the stench of oil and burning flesh billowing up behind them. The Red Maiden watched them disappear into black smoke as they headed for the canyon's lip. She looked up to her right. At the cliff peak, towering over the tunnel entrance, she saw a handful of her men reach the top and run down the opposite side in pursuit of Isaiah. The Red Maiden turned Joshua and kicked his flanks. He charged back up the hill. The Red Maiden's 4,000 surviving foot soldiers followed. When she regained the canyon peak, she galloped straight along the ridge, following the pathway the demons chasing Isaiah and the mastiff had cut in the white snow. The night had just begun, and this night would be hers one bloody fucking way or another. Isaiah jumped the first trench, arcing over the 8-foot gap. He slipped when he landed, hitting hard, sliding to a halt in the snow, a few feet from the first circlets of the thicket. Black Betty landed behind him. Her breath blew out in puffs of white steam. She watched Isaiah to see what he would do. Isaiah stood and looked back. The snowfall was coming in earnest, cutting visibility in half. How close his pursuers were was an open question, but he knew, even with the lead he'd built on them while they climbed the far side, once they reached the peak, they would be on a tear from that point on. Suddenly, the night sky burst into flames. Isaiah could feel the heat suck the surrounding air toward the canal. God damn. Better late than fucking never. He turned the forest of wire and began picking his way through. Getting ensnared here would be a certain end. He knew the explosion had not gotten the men chasing him. Black Betty slipped through the rings after him. Despite her size, she moved with grace and ease that Isaiah could only hope to emulate. She passed him by quickly, and when Isaiah was halfway through, she had already cleared the far side. She barked. Isaiah looked back. The mob of 14 men sprinted the last stretch, leapt over the trench, and poured into the wire entanglements behind him. They hit it in a rush, heedless of the sharp steel fangs, fighting through twice as fast as Isaiah. All the precious time he had earned was vanishing quickly. Isaiah calmed his mind. He moved forward one step at a time. That was the only way out. One step at a time. As Caitlin reached the peak of the canyon wall, she flinched as the whoosh of the explosion and its racing flames kissed the bare skin of her neck. She looked back and witnessed the canal erupting, a Vesuvian inferno. The cries of the dead caught within it, and the shrieks of rage from those trapped on the other side screamed up in its wake. She saw the woman on the white horse reach the mule path. The burning gasoline roared before her. She stared up through the flames at Caitlin. Caitlin's heart sank. She knew the red maiden of her dreams had risen and come for her. Caitlin swallowed hard. She spun and ran toward the trench with Francois just behind her. She slid over the lip and dropped to the duckboards. Francois landed next to her. He grabbed an assault ladder and dragged it across the trench, shoving it against the parapet. He braced it. "Go!" Francois yelled to Caitlin. She grabbed the side rails and raced up the wooden rungs. Once she cleared the ladder, Francois followed fast behind. Thick wire tangles awaited them beyond the parapet. As they began picking through it, Caitlin glanced north, where the rest of her comrades, Donnie, Finn, Durant, Renoir, and behind them Rupert, Wolfgang, Jonah, Adolf, and James were all doing the same. She could no longer see the canyon behind her, but the fire below lit its edge. Black, sooty smoke billowed up and flowed over the rim toward them. Out of the smoke came a line of men, a dozen strong, stumbling. They caught sight of Caitlin and the companions and spread out, separating into 3 teams of 4, hell-bent on hunting down and ending their prey.